We have more for your ears only. I'm Eddie Robinson.
I'm David Alpern with this quote from the news. If Washington sends a former president whenever North Korea holds an American captive, they say it will run out of former presidents. That was Ko-Yu Hwan, a Seoul University expert on North Korea, about speculation that Jimmy Carter or Bill Clinton might travel to Pyongyang to support an official U.S. request for release of the American businessman serving 10 to 15 years at hard labor after a dubious trial for crimes against the state. Now this.
My client, Azamat Ajayakov, feels horrible and was shocked to hear that someone that he knew at the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth, was involved with the Boston Marathon bombing, just like many other individuals who were interviewed on campus. He has cooperated fully with the authorities.
The Boston Marathon bombing case expanded last week with the arrest of 3 school friends of the surviving suspect. 2 of them exchange students from Kazakhstan for impeding the investigation by removing key evidence once they recognized that Jahar Tsarnaev was involved, if they hadn't known before. There was also more focus on the role before and after the bombing of the American wife of the suspect, who died in a shootout with police, Jahar's brother Tamerlan, and on what might have happened if the 2 brothers had actually carried out what Jahar reportedly told interrogators was a last-minute plan to use leftover bombs in New York's Times Square.
Arrest of the 2 exchange students, Azmat Chakayov and Dias Kanarbayev, raised new questions about the student visa system, as well as the FBI and CIA procedures for investigating terror tips, updating watch lists, and sharing intelligence in national security cases. As the House Homeland Security Committee begins hearings on the bombing this week, for your ears only, we consider some of the lessons to be learned with our go-to guest on terrorism since before 9/11. He's Professor Bruce Hoffman, Director of the Center for Security Studies at Georgetown University. Welcome to the program.
Thanks very much. It's great to be back, David.
To what degree does the Boston bombing reflect or require a shift of focus from terror camps and caves to people already here, immigrants or self-converts?
Well, we don't know that, actually, because we still don't know the pedigree of the bombing and the origins of it. Right now, the authorities are investigating up to a dozen other people. Whether that will pan out or not, we don't know. But also the authorities at least have stated that although the bomb itself could have been made from a recipe or instructions, do-it-yourself instructions downloaded from the Internet, the way it was detonated has generated some concern that that wasn't something you could easily acquire from the Internet.
The FBI and CIA got only a vague tip from Russian intelligence that Tamerlan Tsarnaev was becoming radicalized. But can you give us an idea of how many such tips come in from foreign government sources and if they get or should get a special level of investigation?
Certainly in the aftermath of the 9/11, 2001 attacks, this was an enormous problem because there was literally a deluge of tips from all over the world. And, of course, the intelligence services have to run to ground all of them. I'd say that fire hose is certainly diminished over the past 12 years, but we certainly do get lots of tips. And I think they're weighed in a variety of different fashions, depending on their veracity, depending the timing, who they come from. So let me give you an example. When that tip was received from the Russian FSB, they're the successor to the KGB. Well, firstly, I think we have different relations with that service than we would with, let's say, our counterparts in Britain, France, Germany, Australia, and so on. And given that those services are not unknown to harass their own nationals living overseas or on visits, that certainly was part of the filter that I would imagine the FBI had reacted to. Secondly, you have to remember that tip came in the immediate aftermath of the expulsion of several Russian sleepers, not terrorists, but spies who were in the United States. And relations between the U.S. and Russia were not at a very good level at the time. So it may have been that there was an inclination to regard this tip as currying favor with the United States, to try to get back in our good graces by throwing us a bone. It may also have been regarded as a way to distract us from what was then still very heated expulsion of these spies. So I think that certainly played into it. And then, as the authorities have repeatedly remarked since the bombing, the Russian information just wasn't specific enough. And this is always the problem with intelligence, is that when you've got something that, is quote-unquote actionable with a date, a time, a person, leads to follow, it's easier to pursue when the information is rather vague. Now, the FBI did check it out, but they concluded after multiple interviews with Tamerlan Tsarnaev and his family that it wasn't worth pursuing, because we're not like the FSB. We're not like, societies where the police or the authorities are in someone's face. I mean, they investigated it. They concluded at the time there was nothing. Perhaps at the time there wasn't anything to arouse suspicion.
In any event, are you concerned about a failure to follow up with Tamerlan when he returned from the 6-month visit to Dagestan and perhaps parts unknown that the Russians had worried about?
No, that's a good point, and that's a different issue, of course. Again, in hindsight, I think these types of intelligence leads appear much clearer and much more robust than they do at the time when, look, the intelligence agencies, again, this is a strength of the U.S., is that there's been tremendous expansion since 9/11, but we're not a police state. And since we're not a police state, the intelligence agencies, just have to prioritize. They have a limited number of resources, and they have to make hard calls on what are more solid leads. So I think it certainly was an oversight, but until we know the circumstances of precisely why they chose not to follow up with Tamerlan when he returned to the U.S., it's hard to say much more.
Was it a choice, or that he just didn't appear on the right list and that the lists have become too long and confusing?
Well, I mean, that's part of the issue that we're learning, that to get on the, to find yourself on the lowest level list, of which there's 700,000 people, it's not very difficult. And that again gets into the whole question of how robust the information is and whether there's some traction that necessitates follow-up. It's really, the subsequent lists. And I think that's a fair question to ask, why he may have made it onto an initial screening, but, once he came back to the United States, there wasn't the follow-up that there might have been. Again, in retrospect, this seems clear, but of course, there's 700,000 people. There's any number who probably were followed up, and there was no threat. So I think it's a bit rash to conclude that the system we put in place since 9/11 is again broken. I'm not so certain about that.
Talk about the lone wolf issue and the debate over greater infiltration of Islamic communities here versus more encouragement of its voluntary cooperation. In this case, nobody from that community or from Djokhár's school, for that matter, came forward to identify the brothers, as far as we know. Some say that lone wolves often withdraw from their more moderate mosques and other communities.
Well, Tamerlan certainly at his local mosque was very vocal. His condemnation, for instance, of an imam who in a sermon cited Martin Luther King. Basically, the imam said, rebuked him for that, and Tamerlan concluded that, quite rightly, he wasn't welcome there. So on the one hand, we have, a mosque that is obviously very moderate and someone who disagreed with the imam. But again, we don't live in a police state. Where's the line that a disagreement with a cleric necessitates informing the authorities?
Professor Bruce Hoffman is director of the Center for Security Studies at Georgetown University.
Quote from the news, "The boomers had great expectations for what their life might look like, but I think perhaps it hasn't panned out that way." That was Rutgers University sociology professor Julie Phillips on a report that suicide is spiking among middle-aged Americans.
Next, the austerity debate, at home and abroad, for your ears only.